Hello, I'm John Brisson, author of Fix Your Gut, health coach. Welcome to the Fix Your Gut YouTube channel. Today we're going to talk about the condition known as Barrett's esophagus. Now, Barrett's esophagus is pretty scary when you hear about the diagnosis, because there's a link between Barrett's esophagus and esophageal cancer, and a lot of people are very concerned when they hear that. They go get an endoscope done. They've been dealing with reflux issues for quite some time, and all of a sudden they end up having Barrett's esophagus, and the doctor was like, well, we have to get this under control, and that can lead to cancer, specifically esophageal carcinoma, which has a very, very high mortality rate. So people start freaking out. They start, and they should get their reflux under control and everything. I definitely agree with the doctor saying that, but the risk may not be as large as we might thought. It also depends on the type of reflux you have too, and we'll get more into that later. So Barrett's esophagus was named after the surgeon Norman Barrett, who discovered that there were different tissue changes in people with reflux to some degree in the esophagus in the 1900s, but he wasn't the doctor who really discovered what Barrett's esophagus was, and that actually goes to Dr. Philip Roland Allison, who described it very accurately first in 1953, that there was changes of the structure of the esophagus cells from squamous epithelium, which is kind of like these flat lining of cells, to columnar epithelium, which are these more thicker cells that you see in the stomach and the small intestine and the colon, that kind of make up the gut junctions. So the esophagus kind of changes its cellular structure. And Dr. Allison was who coined that term of the change of to columnar epithelium. So actually Barrett's esophagus should really be named after him, because he discovered the condition and actually wrote correctly of what it was. But anyway, so Barrett's esophagus is usually caused by long-term reflux, whether it's acid reflux, pepsin reflux, bile reflux, or endotoxin reflux from gram-negative bacteria. That being said, though, bile reflux seems to be the primary cause of Barrett's esophagus, and we'll talk about the mechanism of actions and why that is later. But acid reflux and pepsin reflux, which is seen as which is known as silent reflux or endotoxin reflux, doesn't necessarily seem to cause it unless the reflux is severe. And acid reflux seems to be the most benign. That it can cause Barrett's, but it usually takes a long period of time, and that's because the esophagus has defensive mechanisms in place that I've talked about many times to inactivate stomach chyme that's acidic that you may reflux. As a lot of people reflux during the day. You reflux a little bit maybe when you're eating food, or when you eat a huge meal and you bend over, or you cough very strongly, or you have a laughing fit, and your esophagus has many mechanisms in place to produce bicarbonate and mucus to neutralize that stomach acid. However, it doesn't really have the mechanisms in place to neutralize pepsin or endotoxins to some degree, or even bile. And bile reflux seems to be the primary cause of Barrett's esophagus, because bile is very alkaline. So those defensive mechanisms in place as far as secreting more bicarbonate isn't really going to do anything, because bile is already alkaline. It's not going to neutralize it. So there seem to be changes into the esophagus when people have Barrett's esophagus. Like I said, it's a change from this flat squamous cell epithelium to more of a columnar epithelium, more of a thicker cell type that make up the epithelium. Also, there's an increase in goblet cells, and goblet cells produce mucus as a way of trying to coat and protect the esophagus from different types of reflux and bile reflux as well. So those seem to be the cellular changes, and the main thing that bile does is the esophagus isn't equipped, like I mentioned earlier, to protect against bile reflux. So it has to do these cellular changes to try to adapt, to try to make your esophagus kind of look more like the small intestine with these mucus producing goblet cells. And it seems to be because bile causes great damage to a tissue that's not prepared for it. So the esophagus, when exposed to bile, specifically the bile acid deoxycholic acid, it injures the tissue. It increases oxidative stress, increases the generation of reactive oxygen species, which damage the mitochondria and the cell themselves. It increases, it decreases expression, SOD2 expression within the mitochondria. as well. And it also seems to stimulate the expression of inflammatory pathways and production of inflammatory cytokines over time. And that's what leads to these changes within the esophagus tissue cellularly. And there's two different proposed theories of mechanism of action of how it occurs. It either starts from tissue changes where the gastroesophageal junction is, where the LES is located, and it works its way upwards where the cells change to more, it kind of spreads upwards where the cells change to more of a columnar epithelium to protect the esophagus. Or actually, the theory that I believe is what's going on are there's these stem cells that the body produces to help maintain the integrity of the esophagus that are esophageal cells are renewed quite frequently. And these stem cells actually change, instead of producing squamous cell epithelium, to columnar epithelium. And that's why if you reduce the reflux and the esophagus actually heals, in a lot of cases Barrett's esophagus will go in remission and will actually reverse itself. And that may be because the stem cells go back to produce squamous cell back from columnar epithelium. So I do think that's probably the actual, really what happens, the mechanism of action that happens. You reflux bile, the body kind of is trying to defend itself, so it changes the stem cells so that it changes the cellular structure of the esophagus from the flat squamous cells to more of a columnar epithelium. And it does increase the risk of cancer because you have all this inflammation going on. You have these cellular changes. You have a depression you have a depression of apoptosis, which is cellular death. And in doing so, it can cause cancer to develop, especially esophageal adenocarcinoma. But the risk of that happening with Barrett's is quite low. They used to say the annual risk was 0.5%. And yes, you heard that right. It was 0.5% of contracting esophageal adenocarcinoma. Now they've lowered it to 0.12% annually, depending on the severity. If you had really severe inflammation, really severe Barrett's esophagus, and it may be close to 0.5%. If it's low to moderate, it may be 0.12% of developing adenocarcinoma per year. That's a small percentage risk. I mean, now I'm not going to say that Barrett's esophagus doesn't cause esophageal adenocarcinoma, because it can, but the risk is very overblown. When you hear it from your doctor, it's a very, very small risk, but it's still something that you should take care of. I'm not saying that you should be refluxing and you can make your Barrett's esophagus worse or develop a Barrett's esophagus. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying when your doctor tells you that this puts you at risk, you should know what that risk is, and the likelihood of that risk is very small. Now, there are things that can increase that list. For example, if you have an ALDH2 polymorphism, which would reduce the enzyme aldehyde dehydrogenase that you would produce, which is using the detoxification of alcohol. And it seems like this gene mutation primarily only affects women, because what it does is when you drink alcohol and you have this polymorphism, you can't detoxify it as well, so it starts affecting the liver, which of course the liver is needed for proper production of hormones. So women with chronic alcoholism or with this polymorphism have a reduction of estrogen. Estrogen seems to be protective of the esophagus and reducing inflammation, which might be why, as far as Barrett's esophagus is concerned, there is a greater diagnostic report and percentages for males than females. And also, if you're overweight, that could lead you, a greater chance of hiatal hernia, could lead you more to reflux. So people who are obese might have a greater chance of developing Barrett's esophagus than someone who is thin. And just like I mentioned earlier, because of the production of estrogen, some women have a lower risk of developing a Barrett's esophagus than men. So if you're a woman and you're suffering from reflux, specifically bile reflux, and you do have this ALDH2 polymorphism or a reduction in aldehyde dehydrogenase, when you drink alcohol, you flush, or if you're definitely if you're Asian descent, this polymorphism seems to affect people of Asian descent, especially if they flush when they drink alcohol. You would definitely want to avoid alcohol because it could increase your risk if you've had Barrett's esophagus of developing esophageal adenocarcinoma, at least per the studies. So symptoms of Barrett's esophagus include usually frequent and chronic long-term acid reflux, silent reflux, endotoxic reflux, or definitely bile reflux. Dysphagia, which is trouble swallowing, vomiting of blood, pain under the breastbone, esophageal pain, esophageal burning, and weight loss or eating reduction. The symptoms of Barrett's esophagus usually fit the symptoms of most reflux diseases. And usually diagnosis of Barrett's esophagus is usually made from endoscope. They usually take biopsies of different parts, usually around the gastrointestinal junction and parts of the esophagus, and look under a microscope to see, inflammation, if increasing goblet cells, columnar epithelial tissue. If you have all three of those, then more than likely you are suffering from some degree of Barrett's esophagus. So what is the protocol I recommend for Barrett's esophagus? I recommend you follow the GERD protocol if you have a gastrointestinal reflux disease, the silent reflux protocol, or the viral reflux protocols if that's what you're suffering from, that are on my website and they're on my book, Fix Your Gut. That will more likely reverse the Barrett's esophagus. Now, there are some supplements that are in the different protocols that seem to be helpful for tackling Barrett's esophagus. Zinc carnosine seems to reduce the inflammation around the gastrointestinal junction, which that may help prevent any type of tissue change around that general area. DGL licorice, aloe vera, slippery elm, marshmallow root, they all can coat the esophagus and help to protect it from reflux. Organic black raspberry powder and studies have been shown to help reduce the formation of reactive oxygen species and damage to the mitochondria and to the cells because of the high antioxidant polyphenols that are in black raspberry powder. So yeah, those are all supplements and have, you can look at the different causes. You have to fix the underlying cause of your Barrett's esophagus. What's causing the GERD, what's causing the silent reflux, or what's causing the bile reflux, to reverse the Barrett's esophagus. And studies have shown that you can reverse Barrett's esophagus more than likely once you reduce the reflux. I hope you found this video informative. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great day.